Now it's time to get to that conversation I promised you. Joining us from Bailie Leadership Consultancy is, of course, as I mentioned, the director. His name is Craig Bailie. And Craig joins us this afternoon to discuss the CRL Commission's Section 22 committee. Now, they had a couple of hearings, first public consultation of the draft regulatory framework for the Christian sector, proposing to regulate religion to end abuses within the Christian church. Consultations are ongoing, ending April 2027. Now, Craig Bailie, who joins us here in studio, attended the East London consultation on July the 14th, and he's here to share his experience of the consultation and his thoughts on matters relating to the regulation of religion in South Africa. Craig Bailie, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming through. It has been a while.
It's been too long, and I'd
like to know why. Yeah, you haven't been busy enough. So now that you're so busy with this kind of work that you do at BLC, it's good to have you here.
Good to be here. Thank you.
The building. Now, maybe Craig, let's start at the beginning. Somebody who may not be familiar with this whole situation. Let's start with the CRL Rights Commission. If you could just briefly break it down for us. What is this CRL Rights Commission about? And then we can get into the Section 22 committee for the Christian sector straight thereafter.
Mr. K, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good and necessary starting point. An organization commonly known as the CRL Commission. That's the Cultural, Linguistic and Religious Rights Commission. Now, this commission is one of South Africa's Chapter 9 institutions. These institutions are outlined, as listeners might have guessed, in Chapter 9 of our country's constitution.
Yeah.
Other examples of Chapter 9 institutions include the Public Protector, the South African Human Rights Commission, the Commission for Gender Equality, the Auditor General, and also the Independent Electoral Commission. Now, the purpose of these Chapter 9 institutions, including the CRL Rights Commission, is to support and strengthen constitutional democracy. Now, anyone who has investigated the current affairs relating to freedom of religion or belief in our country, I should add, with a logical perspective, would have come to the conclusion that there's a significant contradiction between the constitutional purpose of the CRL Rights Commission, which, as I said, is to support and strengthen constitutional democracy, and on the other hand, what the Commission is attempting to do, which in its own words is to promote, advance, encourage the self-regulation of church bodies in South Africa. And that terminology is contentious because there's a debate as to whether it is in fact self-regulation. The Section 22 committee, which we'll speak about in a moment, argues that indeed it is self-regulation, whereas if one reads closely the draft regulation framework, mention is made of legislation. I'll explain later on why we cannot talk about legislation and at the same time call the proposed framework self-regulatory or voluntary. But just to say something more about the CRL Rights Commission, I think it's important that we take note of the name of the Commission Chair. This is Ms. 𝐁𝐿𝐿. I think you'll have to correct me there if my... Perfect. Fantastic.
Yep.
So she's the chairperson of the Commission. She was first appointed in 2014 by then President Jacob Zuma. And when her term ended in 2019, our incumbent President Ramaphosa, reappointed her at the end of 2024 for a further 5-year term. Now, one of the first things she did upon a reappointment was reinitiate her push for what I'm going to call state regulation of religion in South Africa. And maybe just to take a step to the side, I think it's important I'm just going to share two of the quotes that different media sites have shared over time. Two things that the chair of the CRL Rights Commission has said in the past. The first thing she did was call for Christianity to be regulated, specifically Christianity. Cause for concern. Secondly, she has said that anyone who says that God spoke to them must be taken to a psychiatric ward. Now, according to me, that last quote there, it shouldn't offend us as a church. I think we need to be careful to not be offended by such a quote. My view is that what the chair of the CRL Rights Commission said, my view is that the reason why it's problematic is that she said it in her capacity as the chair of this particular institution, which has been mandated, among other things, to protect religious freedom in South Africa. So it's really a case of whether she's professional enough to execute her duties. I'm a supporter of freedom of speech. If someone wants to insult my faith, insult God, I believe they should have the freedom, at least the God I believe in, they should have the freedom to do that. But the real cause for concern here is that she said it in the office, or from within the office that she occupies. You spoke about the Section 22 Committee. Now, this was established in October 2025, and the reason why it's called the Section 22 Committee is because it's based on the CRL Rights Commission Act 19 of 2002. And in Section 22 of that Act, allowance is made for the CRL Rights Commission to appoint or establish a committee to assist it with the performance of its duties. So the Section 22 Committee, specifically for the Christian sector, is an example of such an appointment. Of interest, the original chairperson was Professor Reverend Musa Mulu. He resigned as chairperson of the CRL Rights Commission, at least of its Section 22 Committee, in January 2026, citing fears of the following: state control over churches, an alleged hidden agenda to regulate religion, a toxic and hostile working environment, and lastly, being sidelined by the Commission's leadership. I think those are noteworthy developments when we try and understand what exactly the agenda is in all of this. And the current acting chair is Reverend Dr. John Maloma. He happened to be one of the, I should rather say, the presiding official at the consultation held here in East London just more than a month ago at Destiny Church.
Now, speaking of that consultation, I'd love for you to get into that, in what your experience therein was like. But before you get into that, let's touch on the draft regulatory framework, which you alluded to earlier.
Well, I think maybe it's helpful to start off with the motive behind and the reasons for the framework. And broadly put, the alleged motive, and that's a key word, the alleged motive underlying the publication of the framework, is to provide for governance that prevents abuses within church bodies. Now, I think it's important to recognize, admit, perhaps assume that abuse has taken place at different stages of history in different churches across the globe. The question we're dealing with when we talk about the CRL Commission and its Section 22 Committee is what ought to be done. Well, firstly, rather, what are these abuses? And secondly, what ought to be done about these abuses? But back to the motive. So there's a concern over abuses within church bodies, And the drafters of the framework cite the following, which are worth mentioning under the problem statement of the framework. Firstly, the demonization and delegitimization of others. These are very vague and undefined concepts and terms. The failure of the church to speak with one voice against immoral and unethical practices. How do we define immoral and unethical? Should there be an expectation in the first place that the church speak with one voice about these things, however they may be defined? Thirdly, the absence of accreditation standards and norms within the church. Next, the indiscriminate establishment of churches, which according to the framework threatens the spiritual well-being of the citizenry and the financial stability of the country through illicit flows of funds and intoxicating substances. The final bullet worth mentioning under the problem statement is religious intolerance, unfair discrimination, lack of appreciation of diversity, and disrespect. Now, how are we going to manage disrespect in our country, including across church bodies? So these are some of the justifications and reasons that the Section 22 committee has allegedly given. Again, I say allegedly because there's a debate as to whether this framework is in fact entirely and wholly the work of the committee, or whether it's something that's been inherited by its parent body, which is the CRL Rights Commission. Nowhere in the framework do the authors, whoever these may be, define or provide evidence of these things. Now, I'm not saying, I've mentioned earlier on that we need to admit abuses have happened, do happen, and will continue to happen. But they aren't defined, they aren't accounted for in this framework. And what we need to be questioning in our context is firstly the degree to which these abuses are happening. And that's important in questioning, what legitimizes the extent to which the church is being targeted. We have this draft framework calling for legislation, calling for regulation. We're having meetings at provincial level across all 9 provinces, across, I think, the span of more or less a year. Why so much effort? I did a relatively thorough desktop search for abuses within South African churches beginning in 2014, because that's when the CRL Rights Commission chair, Ms. 𝐁𝐿𝐿 was appointed. I came up, just let me quickly count here, Mr. K. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 cases. Some of those cases involve the same church or the same leader. Beginning in 2014, we have congregants eating grass. 2015, eating hair and cloth. 2015, drinking petrol. In 2016, drinking of an unknown liquid called holy juice. Can you believe it? The same year, congregants drinking Dettol. In the next year, consuming engine cleaning fluid. Further to that, in 2018, news outlets reported the Prophet of Doom, whom I'm sure you're familiar with by now, who sprayed his congregants with a household insecticide and later on got them to eat snake, rat, and dog meat. Sure. The list goes on. Not more than, how many cases did I cite? Let's say 15 cases. And it's important to also mention the Malawian so-called prophet, Shepherd Bushiri, and then also the Nigerian televangelist Timothy Omotoso. Now, the question I'm trying to raise here is, as serious as these cases are, given the fact that we can count them on 2 or 3 hands, does it justify the amount of effort that certain authorities are going to, in their terms, push for self-regulation of church bodies? So the red flag that is being raised here is, what precisely is the agenda? Is the agenda to deal with abuses within church bodies? Or is there a broader, deeper, larger agenda, perhaps I should say a more sinister one, to regulate religion, and perhaps more specifically the Christian sector? And let me just add there, as Christians, as much as we're concerned about our own religious freedom, we also need to advocate for the religious freedom of other faith or religious bodies. Unfortunately, I've come across Christians who've argued, well, I'm all for freedom of religion when it comes to my faith, but not the faith of others. And I think, a scripture that I can't reference explicitly, but I think you and I and many listeners will believe in a God who allows freedom of choice. Not without consequence, but freedom of choice nonetheless. And that principle is what underlines the notion of freedom of religion or belief, which is defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18, and in several other treaties and conventions. It's a biblical concept.
Yeah. Craig Bailie in the building, if you've just joined us. Now, Craig has recently attended a consultation regarding the draft regulatory framework of the Section 22 Committee for the Christian sector. We're talking, of course, about the CRL Rights Commission on the 14th of July. They opened up a consultation, and many people from around the city who belong to the faith community were a part of this particular gathering. Craig, please do tell us.
Mr. K, I'm chuckling. I shouldn't be, because it's a sincere concern of mine. When I heard you refer to many people. So this particular consultation, in fact, I think all of the planned consultations should start at 9 o'clock on whichever day they've been scheduled for.
Yeah.
And maybe just to add, of the 9 consultations at provincial level, 2 have happened. The next one is scheduled for 19 August. When is that? Wednesday.
Yeah, Wednesday.
In the Western Cape. And then the last one, as you mentioned earlier, scheduled for 14 April in the Northern Cape. So the meeting started at 9. At 11 o'clock, I did a quick head count. And there were 36 people in the room, more specifically seated in the audience. And I was concerned about that. Mm-hmm. I've got no idea how many churches there are in East London or the broader BCM and in the surrounding regions, because this is also an opportunity for, I know there was an audience member, for example, from Port Alfred. So for whomever it was convenient to attend this particular consultation, they had the opportunity to register and attend. And I'm just concerned that there was such a low turnout.
Yeah.
That was the first thing I noticed. The other thing I noticed, and it's unfortunately in our country a sensitive topic, is this issue of skin color. I couldn't help but observe that I was one of 2 pale-skinned gentlemen. And it got me thinking about the scripture in Revelation 7 verse 9. After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. So what we have in the scripture is a picture of heaven, and people of all ethnicities, nations, tribes and tongues coming together to praise and worship God. And I couldn't help but wonder, well, what does this, let's call it a skewed representativity in this particular space, say about maybe church relations in BCM and surrounding areas? Mm-hmm. What does it say about the willingness of certain demographics to get involved, assuming they were aware of the consultation? Because I don't want to be unnecessarily or unfair at all. I don't know what the reasons were for the skewed demographics there. The other thing I picked up on was that the representativity was overwhelmingly masculine, number one, mm-hmm. and elderly.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the audience members, one of the younger participants, I hope I can include myself in that group, stood up and challenged the elder audience members about the fact that there were no youth. In fact, very few youth, and certainly from what I saw, I don't think there was anyone under the age of 35,
Wow.
which is our official definition. I think the country's definition of youth is, I think it runs from age 18 to 35.
35, yeah.
I don't think there was anyone in the audience from that age group. However, I mentioned I was discouraged by the turnout. What very quickly encouraged me is when I started, when the presentation had been given by the Section 22 chair, and then the audience was given an opportunity to speak. And maybe I should just say something practical here to help prepare those who are still planning on attending one of these consultations. The audience, at least on the day in question, we were given an opportunity to first ask questions, then make comments, and at the end give inputs on the draft framework. But to my mind, those three things overlap and can be one and the same.
Yeah.
There was also no time management. So whoever had the mic was given as much time as they wanted to speak, meaning not every person who registers will necessarily have an opportunity to speak at one of these consultations. Perhaps those planning on attending should just be prepared for that. I think it would be much better if there's a time allocation based on the number of people registered. But stepping off of that, I wanted to share how encouraged I was when the first speaker stood up and started speaking. And then the next. And then the next. And then the next. Speaking with understanding, speaking with conviction, and all speaking against the proposed so-called self-regulatory framework. Now, I've read through the framework, Mr. K. There's a lot I could say about it, but I think our key concern as a church, indeed as the wider civil society, is the fact that Section 22, Section 2.3 of this draft framework refers to the development of a legislative framework. Now, legislation, I'm sure I'm speaking to those already in the know, but it's worth reinforcing this point. Legislation is not voluntary.
Yeah.
The citizens of no country have the option of whether they want to abide by the law or not. Obviously, they've got the freedom to behave contrary to the law, but must then be open and willing to face the consequences if or when they come. So as soon as the framework refers to the development of a legislative or legislation or a legislative framework, we then immediately move away from self-regulation. By self, I mean the church regulating itself.
Yeah.
We move away from voluntary regulation, and we move into the deeper, darker, more sinister waters of state regulation of religion. Because no matter how much consultation happens on this draft framework with the public, ultimately the ratifying of the legislation, the enforcement of the legislation is the responsibility of the state. And so we can't, there's no way of avoiding that, denying it, running away from it. And I think that is probably the biggest red flag when reading over the draft framework. And certainly everyone who spoke on the day in question understood this and were very vocal about standing against it.
Now, Craig, unfortunately, we are running out of time. In fact, we're already out of time. So we need
have to make some more time, Mr.
Yeah. Absolutely, man. So we need to wrap this up. And I'd just like for you to just, emphasize once again on the importance of getting involved in these kinds of engagements and being part of the process and not being a bystander, because that's unfortunately where most of us in the church end up. And we wake up one day and wonder, hey, How did we get here? You know, all our rights have been stripped away from us, and we were none the wiser. And I know also you're somebody who's open to visiting churches to do this kind of education as well.
Yeah. So I don't think this is just a concern for the church. It's a national concern. Any reasonable person will recognize the role that the church plays in our country's socio-economic development and upliftment, the buffering that the church provides for the vulnerable, for those in need. As soon as we start interfering with religious freedoms, with Christian freedoms, with church freedoms, we are threatening the role that the church plays by leaving it to the state to decide who should be classified as a church, what shouldn't be classified as a church, and who or what should. I don't think this is a time for us to mince our words, Mr. K. You spoke about the church potentially waking up and, wondering, well, how did we get here?
Yeah.
I'm reluctant to call, as someone who has previously, in a previous position, served victims of violations of the freedom of religion or belief in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
As someone who's previously occupied such a position, I'm reluctant to call this what's going on now persecution. However, if this framework is implemented, I am concerned that we're then very much on our road to persecution later on in history. I said this is not a time for us mincing our words. With all due respect to the Section 22 committee, I do not believe this committee is a friend of the church in South Africa. Bear in mind, it is made up of identifying Christians. A gracious assessment of the committee would be to say that it has good intentions, but it is blind to the implications of what it is advocating for. And a less generous, perhaps a more damning assessment is that the committee is knowingly doing the bidding of actors that are determined to erode freedom of religion or belief in South Africa, with a focus at this stage certainly specifically on the Christian sector. I want to encourage churches, church leadership to engage with the Section 22 committee, go to the hearings, but be sure to stand in opposition to what they are proposing. They are good salesmen. To my mind, they're engaging in a lot of marketing. One of the audience members in East London at the consultation in mid-July spoke about the committee, specifically the chair, using flowery words to cushion this framework, at least to place it in a positive light. This is not something we as a church should be tolerating. Aside from inviting people who are in the know, it doesn't have to be me, anyone else willing to teach on this topic, into local churches, I also want to encourage fellow Christians to visit the Dear SA platform and to sign the petition that deals specifically with this threat to religious freedom in South Africa.
Craig Bailie of Bailie Leadership Consultancy, thank you so much for coming through, spending time with us and sharing your experience at the recently held CRL Rights Commission Section 22 hearing or consultation for the Christian sector. And of course, your report definitely leaves a lot to ponder upon. And I trust that you tuning in at home have been schooled to some degree as to what is happening behind the scenes regarding your religious freedom. And I trust that you will take part in the process as much as you can. Craig, always a pleasure having you. And hopefully we'll chat again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mr. K.